as we're transitioning to talk about design and usability, much of the content from today's presentation is going to be based on Donald Norman's principles of design. And Donald Norman is sort of the guru of design and usability. He has written numerous books. The Design of Everyday Things is a seminal work in the field of design and usability. He has written some other books, the Emotional Design, The Design of Future Things, which is an interesting look at how we're going to interact with items in the future, and then Living with Complexity, which is another book which talks about how we are trying to simplify the design and usability of things and how that can be a bad thing because simplicity doesn't always allow us to do the things that we want to do with our tools. So this is a really good book if you're interested in design and usability. It's a really good read, really easy read, and as I mentioned, a seminal work in design and usability. So as we're moving forward, let's start with a simple question. Is good design and usability worth it? Well, good design is something that's really difficult. It takes a lot of additional time to go in and look at these issues that might not have been considered previously and address them in an appropriate and thorough manner in your product. So it takes time. It requires a unique skill set. It's not something that you can just become good at overnight. Design and usability is something that takes a different set of skills than just packaging content and putting it together in a way that might be okay and might be somewhat, might not look terrible, but not necessarily is not necessarily good design or effective usability. So let's look at just a couple of quick examples of some implications of poor design and usability. And this image here shows the ballot used in some parts of Florida in 2000. And if we look at this and look back at the results of this, what we notice is that, well, if we look at the results, what happened with this in Palm Beach County, Florida, is that Pat Buchanan received a significant number of more results or more votes than were anticipated, and Al Gore received a significant number less than anticipated in Palm Beach County, Florida. Now, looking at the design and usability of this, if we look at down the left-hand side, what is theorized to have happened is that because Democratic voters saw Gore and Lieberman second on the left side of the ballot, that they punched in the second hole, which is obviously for Pat Buchanan, the first one on the right side of the ballot. Also, above Gore, you see this hard line, or this line that points to that doesn't point, but goes to the second hole, which is another usability issue here. There's a strong black line above the top of Al Gore's box, which points at Buchanan's marking area. Also, if we look at the voters in Palm Beach County, the average age is around 65 or 66. And we know that one characteristic of 65 and 66 or more elderly people is poor vision. So that the usability issues here combined with the audience led to probably more issues than it might in other areas. Another issue is 3 Mile Island in 1979, which many of you know was a nuclear meltdown. And the image on the right is of the control room, and as you would imagine, the control room of a nuclear facility is rather complex. But some usability issues and design issues here were that the valves and feedback oftentimes showed the last action taken and not the actual physical state. So if I, for example, pressed a button and the button lit up that it had been pressed and stayed in that manner until another action was taken, maybe I pushed like an eject the button button as well, then that would be an example of it showing me the last action taken as opposed to the physical state. So because it showed the last action taken as opposed to the actual physical state, incorrect feedback from the pressure release valve was being seen. Also, there was no direct indicator of the coolant in the reactor, the coolant level. That was inferred from other controls. So just imagine if you are in your car and you're running low on gas, but you didn't have a direct indicator of your gas level. You had to calculate it by the number of miles you had driven and the pressure of your tires and a number of other factors. You had to actually infer how much gas you had based on that, and that would be an example of what was going on here. The direct indicator of the coolant in the reactor was not given. Then, to kind of address another, or to violate another usability and design issue, over 100 alarms sounded in seconds, causing tons of panic. And if we think about alarms today, and if you think about your smartphone, for example, and the alarm, you can set up the alarms to have different ringtones. You can set up your people calling you to have different ringtones to let you know who's calling you. So, for example, if my wife calls me, she has a very specific ringtone. If my mother calls, she has a different ringtone, and that sort of thing. So if I'm in a particular setting, I can know who is calling me and get a relative idea of the importance of that call based on that ringtone. Likewise with alarms, if I set an alarm in the morning, if I have to get up at a certain time, I might set a real annoying, obnoxious alarm, whereas if I just need a suggestion to get up, I might have a more lighter toned alarm. But that's not what happened here. We have 100 alarms sounding, all with no specific indication of what the issue might be, causing panic, obviously. And then the water was escaping from the reactor, so it was exposing the radioactive material, which is a very, very bad situation. So there are a variety of design and usability issues here, from feedback issues to just general mapping and visibility issues, which we'll talk about more later. So these are obviously some extreme cases, but think about some things in everyday life that are poorly designed. And the one that I think of very, very is very common to many people are light switches. And many of y'all have houses or apartments where you have light fixtures with 3 or 4 switches on it. And there's no real rhyme or reason to what items those 4 switches control. And that's just one example. We're going to look at a variety of examples throughout this presentation. And as we're moving through this, think of the everyday things, but also think about how those things relate to web items as well as other media items. And the principles that we're going to look at today are visibility, mappings, affordances, consistency, constraints, and feedback. And these are Norman's principles of design, and we'll talk about each of these in some examples as we move through the presentation. Visibility is pretty straightforward. What to do and how to do it should be visibly obvious. So if things that are real interactions with a particular item should be clear with regards to how you're interacting with them. So if we take a quick look at car interfaces, dashboards are notorious for poor visibility. And if we look at the Some of you may have seen something like this, but if we look at the top here, we have these two similar icons with buttons, and which one of those controls what? What do those icons mean? They're very similar in the look of them. What do they mean? Some even really high-end cars, Cadillacs for example, have icons that are extremely unclear. So it should not only should the icons be sufficiently different to know that they control distinct items, but the actual icons should be clear. It should be something that people are familiar with. And then if we look at the bottom two here, these buttons are just blank, so what do they control? What are they there for? And these are probably for upgrades, but they're probably designed for the manufacturer to allow them some additional space for upgrades, but for the end user, they're problematic. And then you have this dial here, and there's nothing on this panel that indicates that it would be controlled by a dial. So what might that be used for? So what are some visibility issues with media elements? So what to do and how to do it should be visibly obvious for a number of media elements. Some common things might be links, hiding various navigational elements. If an image is a video or a link to a video, letting the user know that it is an actual video. So there are a variety of issues here with media that are extremely common visibility problems. There should not be any cognitive load spent trying to figure out how an individual should interact with various media in an e-learning or product, or any product. Now, mappings are closely related to visibility in that the action, or the relationship between the action and the outcome, should be obvious. And here, the mappings should help a user build a good conceptual model, and the user should infer from the mappings what is going to occur. They use physical analogies and cultural standards. So when using a knob, obviously, like a volume knob, the standard would be to increase it by turning it to the right, or to decrease it, turn it to the left. There are also cultural differences here. So when using a light switch, the standards in the US would be up is on and down is off, but in Britain, down is on and up is off. So it's important to consider these cultural standards when addressing mapping issues. If any of y'all have been to Heathrow Airport, it's kind of interesting that they have a series of visuals, and then they have countries or words associated with them based on the countries. For example, they have football, and they'll have the word football, and then they'll have US, and they'll have a picture of a football player. Then they'll have Britain or another country that plays soccer, football, and they'll have sort of a soccer graphic. And then they have Australia, where they're playing sort of a rugby type game. So and then they'll have cricket. They have cricket as well, and they'll say pest in the United States, delicacy in another country, and then like a religious icon in another country. So it's important to consider these cultural standards as well. There's some other mapping examples. So with desktop items and user operating systems, using folders and files and that kind of thing, it would be an example of mapping. Using handles, using switches, those sorts of things are examples of mappings in web and media. And they use already established conventions, which is kind of related to the issues we've been talking about here. Now, this is just one quick example. How do you open the fridge here? And this is actually one that I had in an apartment that I lived in Gainesville when I was in graduate school. And we see that the handle is on the left side or the right side, depending on where the hinges are laid out. This is an example of it. If I pull the handle, I would expect for the door to open, but because the handle is on both sides, then that's not what actually occurs. Only when I pull the handle on one of the sides without the hinges will the door open. This is an example of where this was designed to benefit the interior designer, in that this model can be used in a variety of different kitchen layouts and is very common in apartment complexes because you can move it around rather easily, but is not beneficial to the end user. So because as I mentioned, I had this, and numerous times after living there 3 years would try to open it up from the wrong side because I automatically saw the handle and would pull whichever one was more convenient for me. Now, one way you could address this would be to put some kind of cover over the handle in the side that's not being utilized, and that's pretty easy to do, but often very rarely actually done. If we think of media here, we start looking at color schemes, people trying to get creative a lot of times and hide things, and what a lot of times these things lead to bad mapping. So when you typically want to be very straightforward, very open in your addressing of mapping issues. Now, affordances relate to mapping, but they're not as outcome-based. So what affordances reference are visual clues on how to interact with an object. So if I see a knob, that affords turning. When I see levers, that afford moving. Buttons afford pushing, that sort of thing. As with mapping, there are cultural and learned affordances. For example, scroll bars aren't something that you would normally see out in the world, so the way you know how to interact with a scroll bar is having learned, okay, whenever I see this bar on the right side of my screen, I'm going to scroll. And then various cursors afford particular operations as well. So if you see the hand with the pointy finger, you know that's a link. If you see the pointer, you know that's where your cursor is, and you kind of move it around. If you see the sort of grass fist, it means you can kind of drag things around a little bit. So different cursors afford various operations as well. Well-designed objects, as you would expect, have good clues and good affordances, and poorly designed objects have either no or false clues. And one quick example of this is a car door handle. And car door handles of old, you don't typically see these nowadays, but this is there's some cognitive dissonance here in that when you interact with this handle, to open the door you pull, but to actually interact with this handle appropriately, you push the button. So pushing the button and then pulling to open is that false affordance there. Here's another example in that this is my cabinet in my office, and we see the top handle here, which affords pulling, but if I actually pull it, nothing happens. So the way to open my drawers here are to pull the handles on the bottom. The top item does not open at all, and I actually have no idea what this handle is used for. There's no like slab to write on or anything like that. It does not move at all. So let's look at some software examples of affordances. And here, this is an example of a good affordance. How do we zoom in this tool called Kai? Well, as you would expect, you would click on the magnifying glass in the upper right-hand corner to zoom in on this particular image. And this is an image editing tool. Well, if we look at some other examples, such as the old version of Microsoft Word, we see a couple of magnifying glasses. We see one to the right, in the upper right, just next to the two to the left of the percentage there, and then also directly to the right of the printer, more on the left side, you see the magnifying glass there. So those are two affordances, two bad affordances, in that seeing magnifying glasses kind of indicates a zooming aspect. Well, most of y'all know that to zoom here, what we would actually do is modify the percentage from 100% to 150 or to whatever percentage we wanted to either zoom in or zoom out. If we think about some other examples with media, one good example is online shopping and the concept of a shopping cart, where you add items into it. You can also do a wish list, so you can kind of hold them in the wish list area. But the shopping cart, you put it in your shopping cart and then you check out. So that's an example of a good affordance. Some bad affordances with media are objects that look like buttons but aren't really buttons, and this is extremely common on websites and in media in general. Also, underlined text that is not linked. So obviously whenever we see underlined content, we expect that that content is to be linked. So seeing underlined content that is not linked is problematic, as well as blue text. Whenever we see blue text, whether it's underlined or not, we associate that with linking. And so anytime we see blue text and it's not a hyperlink, then that is problematic as well. Next, we have constraints, and there are four types of constraints. Physical constraints, which constrain possible actions using physical limitations. So an example of this would be a key in a lock. You can't fit a key that isn't associated with a particular lock into the lock, so constraining that action using a physical limitation. A semantic constraint is a constraining possible actions using the meaningfulness of the situation. So an example of this would be that whenever you access a read-only document, the editing controls are disabled. That would be an example there. Then we have cultural constraints, or constraining possible actions using cultural standards. So here, if you see a big red sign, that's going to mean stop. If you see a green sign, that might mean go on a particular media tool or web tool. And then there are logical constraints, which include constraining actions based on the logical order of tasks. So if you've ever been to a kiosk in an airport and the self check-in kiosk, you have to go through a series of events, typing in your confirmation number, how many bags do you have, do you want to upgrade your seats. So you have to go through each of these events before you can actually print out your boarding pass. Or if you're downloading software, you have to accept the license agreement first, and it won't let you download the software or install the software until you accept the licensing agreement. Those sorts of things would be examples of logical constraints. Here we have an example of a physical constraint where both of these handles, if you pull on them, you would open the doors. But we have this metal bar here which prohibits you pulling one door open over the other one. So is this a good or bad physical constraint? Well, it depends on what the purpose of it is. And what was theorized in class is that the bar is there to sort of stop people from breaking into, sort of picking the lock with a credit card or something like that. So the bar is there to avoid people sliding things in. And then getting into the suite where the majority of the other offices could also be accessed that way. So that's what it was theorized. So for that reason, it might be a good constraint. But in general, as far as a usability, from a usability perspective goes, to block the opening of one door when both doors should be able to be pulled would be a bad constraint. Then next we're going to look at consistency, and with consistency, this simply refers to interfaces having similar operations and using similar elements for similar tasks. So whenever we use the control key and an initial, that we always use control for some kind of operation. So control C is copy, control X is cut, control S is select, etc. So using that control first is an example of consistency. The main benefit of consistency, and we're going to look at a couple levels here, is that these interfaces are easier to learn and use. So if you look at large entities like YouTube and Facebook and those sorts of things, they are consistent with the way you interact with them. So over time, those things become much easier to interact with. And then there are multiple levels, internal and external. And if you think of like branded items like Logitech universal remotes for any of you, or coffee makers or cars, Volkswagen is one that's really into this idea of this global consistency among their different models. So looking at this makes people start getting familiar with the brands and more comfortable with the brands, and then becoming more likely to purchase and use those brands. Now, if we're looking at media elements, we look at internal consistency, we mean within an individual environment. So within a single website or within a single page on a website. So here we're looking at, on the same screen, we're looking at buttons, fonts, headers, all of those things being the same. When you move from screen to screen, the user interface controls, so using buttons on every page or text links on every page, the layout, so where the navigation menus are, where the content is located, where the footer is, those sorts of things, and then the font family. You want to be consistent internally with the vocabulary as well. If you're dealing externally, you can kind of modify that depending on the audience. So if I were creating a list of items or a series of tools for K through 12, I would use a different vocabulary with the lower level items than I would with the higher level items. And then the reasons for internal consistency, as kind of piggybacking on what we talked about before: more rapid or accurate pattern induction, and then more confidence in interacting with the products. Now, external consistency refers to consistency across different systems or between the real world and a system. So if we look at Macintosh, the Mac apps and Windows apps, people interact with them in very similar manners. So if we look at the garbage, the trash can on a Macintosh, that would be analogous to the recycle bin on a Windows operating system. So folders are the same, the way you interact with files are the same, those sorts of issues are there. Now, obviously there are differences that set them apart, but the primary ways of interacting with them and the ways that most people interact with these different systems are going to be very similar. This wasn't as much the case in the past, but primarily nowadays there's much more external consistency between these different systems. As with the internal consistency, this enables the transfer of learning from one system to another, so it's easier to move back and forth between them. And then, as I kind of mentioned before, a lot of these use visual metaphors: your trash can, your recycle bin, folders, different things like that. And if you look at just between systems here, Microsoft Front Page is a web editor, and Microsoft Word is a word processing document. And if you look at these, that we see that much of the things, many of the ways we do the different tasks is the same for both of these. So if I want to save these, if I want to modify the font, if I want to indent fonts, if I want to add a link, all of these are going to be the same within Front Page and Word. And this is also the same as when we look at other Microsoft Office products. When we look at PowerPoint and Excel, the primary differences in those is that the way you do the task that particular application specializes in, spreadsheets, for example, or presentations for PowerPoint, those tasks or tasks associated with creating a presentation and creating a spreadsheet are the ones that vary. All of the other tasks, changing font colors, formatting, all of those, printing, saving, reviewing, all of those are the same from product to product to product, which is extremely important. So on your sites and in your projects, it's really important to address consistency issues and making sure you have have a style guide in place, making sure that you know making sure that the way you approach and present information is consistent from one piece of media or one element of your product to the other. And then lastly, we have feedback, and feedback shows the outcome of an action. It needs to be obvious, so being subtle with your feedback is bad. It needs to be immediate, so obviously whenever they perform an action and feedback is appropriate, then it needs to be done immediate. Don't delay feedback. Delayed feedback is actually worse than no feedback. It has a more negative impact than no feedback. It needs to be valid, so it needs to obviously convey the right information, and it needs to be persistent. So you need to be consistent with your use of feedback throughout. For error feedback, you need to have a positive tone, suggest a corrective action, and then use appropriate vocabulary. Just a couple quick examples here. One, this is from an Apple website, and if you look at this there, it's not really necessarily a negative tone. It's not a positive tone, but it's definitely not obvious. It's definitely doesn't use appropriate vocabulary. It does not really suggest a corrective action that most people would know. So it just says, if necessary, run a people code trace. So this is an example of a very poor feedback message. This is the actual Apple old OS 9 system error that you would receive. You would receive a bomb, which definitely is not a very positive tone. So Apple's actually had some issues with feedback in the past. What are some feedback issues that you will need to address in your project? So this is difficult for me to address, but where would feedback be appropriate in your tool? So as you're designing your product, go through and make sure that you anticipate areas where there might be potential issues, and you appropriately address those potential issues with feedback and integrating that into your particular product. So we've looked at a few examples, and let's explore a couple other ones very quickly, and then we'll move into addressing some tools. This is a picture of two insulin bottles, and if we look at these bottles, we see that they're relatively similar. They're the same size. They had the differences include a little shape. One has a diamond and one has a square, and then the letters R and N. So obviously these are differences in doses. One of the issues here is that one of the problems with diabetics is vision problems. So it would seem to make more sense logically to have the bottles look much different, maybe having one squared and one round and that sort of thing, making much more significant design differences than are indicated here. This is an example of some toothpaste or ointment, and I'm sure many of y'all have interacted with these before, where you open up the ointment and it's sealed with some aluminum sealing. And to actually open these, there is a opener in the lid, so you would just simply turn it around and put it, but that's kind of hidden. So do not hide ways to do things. So a lot of times, again, people trying to be cute, not necessarily in this case, but in their software and in their design and their look, they try and hide things or make things more subtle when they need to be much more obvious and more out in the open. This is a schematic of a stove, and I'm sure many of y'all have had these in the past, where the four burners are in a perfect square, and then you have across the back you have perfectly aligned the four controllers, but it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because you have to actually read and then think, okay, is it back or front? And the controls are very unclear in the schematic. Nowadays you see the controls are offset in the back or on the control panel, so the ones in the back are higher up and the ones in the front are further down. Or you will also see more graphically enhanced controls. Sometimes you even see the controls on the burner surface in a schematic, sort of a miniature arrangement that parallels the rest of the stovetop. So you might see all 4 of them in the middle, with them controlling the one close to the burner that they're close to. Now also it gets more complex nowadays with stoves having bridges and warming zones and all of these things. So with 4 or so controls controlling a variety of different setups, you might have an inside a single burner having 3 levels of heat. So how to visually represent that is extremely important. Some of these are done really well, and some of these are done very, very poorly. So it's important to have a very clear control scheme when setting up your media elements. This is actually an interior where it's of a car where the controls to the radio are first low, very low in the setup, and blocked by drink holders. And changing the radio or adding in a musical device or something like that is a basic function of an automobile. So it's important to make basic functions easy and not constrain basic functions. So in your media elements, consider what are the basic functions, and is it very clear, very easy to perform these basic functions. It might be watching a video, and you might want to have if you have a very large video, for example, you might want to have it embedded in the web page as opposed to something they download. But it might be appropriate to have it as something they download, as you might want them to maybe have it on their own to revisit it and not have to always have a web connection to get it. So that's important to kind of consider as you're designing your media products. This is one that you see at a lot of universities and institutions, but there was one actually outside the College of Ed building here, where there was a path that people took that worn down over time because it was the area was poorly designed and the path was blocked by grass, whereas other paths with concrete and brick were not. But people chose to take the path of least resistance, and this is an illustration of why analysis is important. And so examining what paths people are going to take, maybe before doing the full design of the environment, is important. So maybe pilot testing or those sort of things would make this a much better situation. This is what actually happened. This is similar to what happened at UNC Charlotte. Is they did some of the design of the layout, but then they went back after the fact, after noticing where the paths were, where the foot traffic tended to be, and then they redesigned based on that foot traffic. And then this is an example of knowing the setting and considering the setting in which your product is going to be used. If we look at this is suntan sunscreen, which is oily, and usually when you are using sunscreen, you put it on one hand and that hand gets oily or slick, and then you administer it. Here we look at this and there are no grips. So what might be better for this particular product is to put some sort of grips on the tool, on the sunscreen bottle, so that it doesn't slip, fall in the sand, or whatever. So when you're designing your media tools, consider the environment in which something is going to be used. So is it going to be viewed on a phone or a tablet, which is much more common these days? Or what kind of internet connection speeds are your end users going to have? So very important to consider. Okay, so we're going to just skip this part here and move on to media types, uses, and tools. Now, in your product,
if we consider the development of text and hypertext, obviously there are tons of tools that do this. Notepad for very basic items. Word is obviously a text editor tool. OpenOffice Writer is a text editor tool. You also have cloud-based tools such as Google Docs and others that can be implemented in the development of your text and hypertext materials. As we think about audio, there are tons of uses of audio that can be implemented in your product. Obviously, audio can be used as a nice feature to introduce a concept or a product or how the users are going to interact with the product. It can also be used to provide context and additional guidance and structure and intentionality when developing a product. And I'm a big fan also of audio feedback. So using audio as a tool to provide feedback to the user in some way may be useful as well. As with text and hypertext, there's a ton of tools for the development of audio. If we look at open source tools such as Audacity, you can download Audacity for free. All of these are located in the course materials. There are also tools such as GarageBand, other editing tools within suites such as Adobe's Creative Cloud. Then you also have a variety of cloud-based audio tools such as SoundCloud or AudioBoo that you can use to develop your audio. And all of these are welcome. There are no constraints on the development tools implemented in your projects. If we look at video, again, video has many of the similar benefits and ways it can be used as audio. Just a ton of flexibility with the integration of video. Also, what's great about video is there are tons of existing video resources that can be implemented into a project. The key with that is customizing it to fit within your individual product. So that may be constraining a portion of the video to be viewed or something along those lines. It is very flexible in nature and has, as I mentioned, just a whole ton of pedagogical benefits. When we consider the types of tools that can be used, there are many video editors out there, many cloud-based video editors as well. So Adobe Creative Cloud has a suite. Apple has a video editing suite. Microsoft has its own video editing suite. YouTube used to have its own video editing suite. I'm not sure if it's still functional, depending on when this video is being viewed. But there are just a variety of those out there. You also consider screen capture video, which is common in creating instructional materials. So you have Camtasia. There are also other free screen capturing video resources that are out there that can be implemented. And then you have cloud-based video tools as well, such as YouTube and others. So just a whole array of options for the development of video. When we consider hypermedia, just again, a key with the integration of hypermedia into the teaching and learning environment or the instructional setting is the end user. So we need to consider the experience the user has with the content and as well as the experience the user has with technology, and sort of consider almost a sliding scale. So the more experienced they are with the content, then the more user control we can provide via the hypermedia environment. And less experienced they are with the content, vice versa, the opposite of that. Likewise with the experience with technology. So the more experience they have with technology, the more user control we can provide, the less experience they don't. We want to provide less user control. And then there are a whole array of hypermedia tools. You have your web editing tools, you have Captivate, you have Articulate. PowerPoint can be used as a tool to create hypermedia. So we have a variety of options for hypermedia. And again, these are all included in the course materials in Module 3. And then graphics, again, there's a ton of options for graphics. They're very great for providing analogies. They're great for just a whole array of pedagogical approaches. And these are addressed in previous courses in the program as well as in this one. and just a ton of tools. You have, obviously, within Creative Cloud, you have Photoshop, which is kind of an industry standard. If we're looking at free or open source tools, you have GIMP. And then even within tools like PowerPoint and others, they have a lot of graphic editing features built in. If we look at cloud-based tools, there are a number of those, but they're not really, it's not a primary focus of cloud-based tools. So really the key ones that are embedded graphic editing functionality, and then Photoshop, and then GIMP as well. There are some other open source tools, and as these, I'm not going to get into specifics of these, as over time these change quite a bit. And then when we start thinking of other tools, we think about maybe non-traditional tools. So kind of as a tool that we can utilize to create many of the audio, video, other aspects, text, hypertext that we talked about, artificial intelligence. So how can we use generative artificial intelligence in a way that is responsible and appropriate for the development of our media? We've seen now there's an artificial intelligence tool that creates video. There's an AI that creates graphics, so DALL-E. We have the text hypertext with ChatGPT, among others. So just a whole array of AI tools. Then when you look at like modeling and simulation tools, we also want to consider, I wouldn't necessarily call this a non-traditional tool, but we want to consider how our product is going to be disseminated. So are we going to create a web-based tool, and within that, are we going to use a cloud-based web sites such as Google Sites or Weebly or Wix, or are we going to use a more traditional website, like maybe something that would be posted on your rhartshorn.com server space, or WordPress, or a variety of other options with regard to web editing? Or are we using a learning management system? So do we have access to Canvas, or does our setting involve the use of Blackboard or Moodle or other learning management systems? Or do we use the entity that we're developing this for, do they use a content management system like Joomla or Drupal or something like that? And how do we implement those? Then do we get into Captivate or Articulate? Are we making a more kind of complex e-learning environment? So there's a number of non-traditional tools. There's also some other tools like Voki and other tools that perform interesting functions that fall within the other categories, but not necessarily are a specific traditional use of those particular forms of media. So that is all for the design usability presentation. As you're moving forward, consider all of these issues. Again, no constraints on the types of development tools that are going to be used. That is up to you and your group. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And have a great week.